So let's look this week a little bit at the policies, practices, and programs. And we're going to start with investigating how legislation can impact, support really the practice and pedagogy of students with disabilities. This includes major national and state regulations, as well as civil rights legislation. These important laws paved the way for inclusion of students with disabilities, and they outline the identification and assessment process that we're going to dive into a little bit later in the term. So, as you're thinking about this week's content, you want to be able to identify some of the major court cases that led to the enactment of Public Law 94-142. I would like you to be able to summarize some key components of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act from 1975 to 2004 and be able to describe the legislative intent of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Americans with Disabilities Act. We're going to start with some key special education cases, and there are really 6 of those that you should look at. One is Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. This was in 1954. The next one is Park versus the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. This was in 1972. Board of Education addressed Hendrick Hudson Central School District versus Rowley. And Daniel R.R. versus the State Board of Education, which was in 1989. We've also got Oberti versus Board of Education of the Borough of Clementon School District. That was in 1992. And finally, Cedar Rapids Community School District versus Garrett F. That was in 1999. I'm going to encourage you to look in the text and also Google each of these cases to learn a little bit more about them and how they have impacted our current way that we do education. There's also some key special education legislation. Now, there's really 2 that we're talking about here. This is PL 94-142. This was formerly known as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. This is 1975. We don't say handicapped anymore, so this becomes later IDEA. Now, what this PL 94-142 did was it established these 6 areas or 6 things for children with disabilities. First, we'll call it FAPE. This is the Free Appropriate Public Education. Now, this guarantees free and appropriate education for all students who have disabilities, including special education, related services, and individualized education programs. Second is LRE, the Least Restrictive Environment. This ensures that our children with disabilities they can attend as many general education classes as possible so they aren't permanently segregated from their classmates. Third, we've got parental participation. We want parents to be involved in the design of the curriculum, and those parents can appeal school decisions that may affect their child's education. PL 94-142 also establishes procedural safeguards, and this means that parents have the right to review their child's educational records, receive notice before meetings about their child's evaluation, and they can request an independent educational evaluation if they are concerned about the evaluation that the district has provided. Another key thing that this legislation provides is NDA, or non-discriminatory assessment. So before placement, a multidisciplinary team must evaluate a child in all areas of suspected disability, and they have to use tests that are not racially, culturally, or linguistically biased. And then last, we get zero reject. And then this is the idea that all children, regardless of the severity of their disability, must receive an education that meets their needs at no cost to parents or guardians. There's also 3 key civil rights pieces of legislation that you should know. One is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Now, many of you are familiar with 504 or 504 plans, and sometimes people erroneously assume that that belongs with the IDEA legislation, but it does not. It's part of the Rehabilitation Act. So let's look into that, but we'll do that a little bit later in the term. Next is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was enacted in 1990, and then the Americans with Disabilities Act amendments of 2008. And we'll talk more about that as we go, but please Google that and see what you can find out. I also want to encourage you to think about person first language versus identity first language. In this class, for your written language, we come to this as the role of professionals, right? So as professional counselors or teachers or speech pathologists or whatever profession that we are in. And from that, the default is going to be person first. We use person first languages as describing people with disabilities, focusing on the person, their skills, what they do, as opposed to identifying them by or as their disability. Now, there are some key times when we don't do this. First of all, is if a person with a disability has asked you to use identity first language, then you do that. It's respectful. It's the same as someone saying, this is the name I'd prefer to be called. We use the name that they asked to be called. So in a setting where, let's say you're in an IEP meeting or you're in a counseling session and the person with a disability says, I would like to be referred to as disabled, or I would like to be referred to as autistic, then absolutely you should use that language. When you are in a professional context, though, when you are at a meeting, a multidisciplinary meeting, or you're giving a professional development or training, we default to person first language unless and until someone asks us to specifically refer to them. So I've included an article that's in the framework for you to review that. If you yourself have a disability and want to use identity first language, of course you should do that. But remember that you're only referring to yourself. When we're talking about the large group, unless we're talking about something very specific, then we default to person first. Part of this is because attitudes are pretty powerful. Negative stereotypes and cultural beliefs about people with disabilities can impact the way people think and act, and that affects the experiences of people who have disabilities and our everyday lives. So that's just something to be thinking about. Also, we want to talk a little bit about some other language. Exceptional children. This is the language that the federal government and our state uses when it's talking about both children with disabilities and students who would receive services for gifts and talents. Also, disability versus handicap. So, exceptional children, that language is used in the legislation because it's considered an inclusive term. And it can be used for really for anyone on that spectrum of having a disability all the way up to, gifted and talented. It's important to recognize the difference in the meaning and implications of the terms disability and handicap, even though people use them interchangeably. Disability is the limitation or the inability to perform a task in a certain way. For example, a person who has paralysis of the leg muscles or cognitive impairments or loss of sight or hearing, emotional disturbances or learning disabilities. We're talking about the actual disability. When we're talking about a handicap, this is really referring to the problems or difficulties that the person with a disability encounters because of their disability. For example, a building that isn't wheelchair accessible, or a building that has braille signs that are posted too far into the building for a person with blindness to use, or when people are marginalized or discriminated due to negative social attitudes. So that handicap is generally something that happens to a person with disability. It's not the actual disability of the person. And the big one that comes up is people say, what about parking, right? So the language to use there is it's accessible parking, right? That's what we're going for, is to create accessible communities, accessible classrooms, accessible everything else. Some other important terms to think about that we're going to have. We've got this term developmental delay. So we're going to talk about the 13 categories of disability, but many states have a different criteria for identifying what's called a developmental delay. For example, sometimes testing or standardized tests or comparing developmental milestones. Current legislation allows the states to use the term developmental delay for children aged 3 through 9. And then after that age of 9, they have to use, the states or the districts have to use a specific disability labeling for children to continue receiving services. So in Ohio, our legislation was just changed. It used to only go up through age 3, but now it goes up to age 9 as well. Now, when we're talking about the term at risk, these are children who are generally not identified as having a disability yet, but they have a high probability of manifesting a disability due to biological, genetic, or environmental factors, adverse circumstances, or factors that can contribute to delays in learning or development, but it's not a guarantee. Third, we say special education. Special education is the customized instructional program that considers materials, equipment, services, and teaching strategies to meet the needs of students with disabilities. Special education is often conducted in the general education classroom, and not all students with disabilities will require special education programming. Students who get special education services will have an IEP, or an individualized education program. The next term is related services. These are the services provided by professionals who work with students with disabilities. Related services are an integral part of special education programs if the students require them, and we'll discuss those a little bit later, but these are going to be things like speech-language pathology, occupational therapy, behavior therapy, all kinds of things like that. Physical therapy too. The next word is incidence. Incidence refers to a rate of inception, or the number of new instances of a disability occurring within a given time frame. Usually we're talking about 1 year. And then prevalence refers to the total number of individuals with a particular disability currently existing in the population at a given time. So you'll see those words, hear those words throughout the semester. And then I want to show you these 13 federal categories of disabilities. We've got autism, deafblindness, developmental delay, emotional disturbance, hearing impairments, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairments, other health impairment, specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, traumatic brain injury, and visual impairments, including blindness. What you don't see on that list is the term special needs. Special needs are not a protected category, and there's no reason to not just go ahead and say disability. A lot of times people use special needs as a euphemism for disability, and that perpetuates a myth that there is something unnatural or really pitiful, something that we would pity about having a disability. When the fact of the matter is, disability is a natural part of life. And most of us, if we live long enough, will experience disability at some time in our lives, whether it's through injury or illness or just getting old. So special needs needs to be removed from our professional vocabulary because it's not a category that is protected by federal legislation. One of the things that I want you to be able to think about as we go into the next week is some of the pros and cons about labeling, using labels to identify people with disabilities. And then I want you to really think about, and I'll send you some articles, but the increase in the number of students who are receiving special education services. That number has continued to go up every year for as long as special education has been in our education system. Okay, so that's just a brief introduction to these policies, procedures, and programs. All right, you've got everything you need for this week in the course calendar. Of course, if you have questions, you should feel free to send me an email or set up an online virtual appointment with me. Hope you have a great week.